Before the church bells finished ringing across the Sunday morning air, before the sparrows lifted from the iron gate, a small voice in the garden called out a word that would shatter everything. "Papa, watch me spin." A second voice followed. "Papa, pick me up." And then a third. "Papa, I love you." The man kneeling in the grass smiled and opened his arms to all three children. He held them like they were made of light. 20 feet away, standing at the edge of the garden wall where no one had seen him arrive, Dominic Zareth stopped breathing. Because those three children, the ones laughing, the ones spinning, the ones calling another man Papa, they carried his blood. They had his eyes. And they did not know he existed. Even the man who controlled half the city's underworld could not control this. The cottage sat at the end of Briarwood Lane in a town called Fenwick, 3 hours north of the city where Dominic Zareth had built his empire. It was the kind of place that did not appear on the maps he studied. The kind of town that existed between highways and beneath notice. The garden was small, but alive. Tomato vines climbed a wooden trellis. Sunflowers leaned toward the morning light like parishioners bowing in prayer. A stone path wound from the back door to a wooden bench where a woman sat watching the scene unfold. She had a cup of tea in her hands. She was smiling. Not the careful, measured smile of a woman who has learned to perform happiness, but the real kind. The kind that reaches the eyes and stays there without waiting for permission. The cottage had white shutters and a blue door that she had painted herself the first spring after she arrived. The paint had chipped in places now, but she had not fixed it because the chips reminded her that time was passing, that she had survived long enough for paint to weather, that she was still here. Inside the cottage, the walls held photographs. The triplets at 1 year old, sitting in a row on a checkered blanket. The triplets at 2, covered in birthday cake. The triplets yesterday, holding wild flowers they had picked from the meadow behind the church. There were no photographs of the man who had fathered them. Not one. It was as if he had never existed. And for Neve Callister and her children, until this morning, standing unseen at the edge of the garden wall, he truly had not. 2 years and 3 months earlier, Neve Callister still believed she was loved. She lived in a house with 14 rooms in the Ashworth Hills district, a neighborhood where the lawns were trimmed by hired hands and the gates opened only for recognized license plates. The house was limestone and iron. The windows were tall and always clean. The furniture had been chosen by a decorator whose name she had never been told, and it was beautiful in the way that museum exhibits are beautiful. Perfect. Untouchable. Cold. Neve was 28 years old. She had dark hair that fell past her shoulders and gray eyes that used to hold laughter but now held something closer to vigilance. Her hands had a habit of folding themselves in her lap, fingers interlaced, as if she were always waiting to be told what to do next. She had been married to Dominic Zareth for 3 years. She had met him at a gallery opening in the city, a charity event where she had been working as an assistant to the curator, and he had been the largest donor of the evening. He had looked at her across the room the way a man looks at something he intends to own, and she had mistaken that look for desire, for love, for fate. The first year of the marriage had been a performance of devotion, flowers delivered without occasion, weekends in cities she had only seen in photographs, a closet filled with dresses she had not chosen but wore because he preferred them. She had not noticed at first how the gifts always came after the silences, or how the silences always followed questions he did not want to answer. She had not noticed how slowly, carefully, like a vine creeping up a wall, his control had wrapped itself around every corner of her life. By the second year, she had no job, no friends outside his circle, no access to the bank accounts, only a card that he monitored. She drove a car registered in his name. She lived in a house that she could not leave without explanation. She ate meals prepared by a cook who reported the contents of the refrigerator to Dominic weekly. She wore her hair the way he preferred it. She spoke to his associates with the words he had rehearsed with her the night before. And when she became pregnant with triplets, he had kissed her forehead and whispered that she had finally done something useful. She remembered that word. Useful. She had lain awake that night with her hand on her belly, feeling the first faint stirrings of life beneath her skin, and she had told herself that he did not mean it the way it sounded, that he was simply not good with words, that men like Dominic, men who carried empires on their shoulders, could not be expected to speak like poets. But somewhere beneath the excuses, in the part of herself she had learned to silence, Neve knew. She knew when he stopped coming home before midnight. She knew when the phone calls started, the ones he took in the other room with the door locked. She knew when she found the receipt for a necklace she had never received, a ruby pendant worth more than her mother's house. She knew when the staff began to look at her with something that was not quite pity, but lived in the same neighborhood. She knew when his hand stopped reaching for hers at dinner, when his eyes stopped finding her face across a room, when she became furniture. And she knew on the night of the Castellan Gala, when everything she had tried not to see was dragged into the light and held up for 400 guests to witness. That was the night Dominic Zareth told the world exactly what his wife was worth to him, and it was less than nothing. The Castellan Gala was held every November in the grand ballroom of the Monarch Hotel, a building that had stood at the center of the city for 90 years and had witnessed more deals, more betrayals, and more performances of wealth than any courthouse or cathedral. The chandeliers alone were worth more than most houses. The guest list was curated like a museum collection. 400 names, 400 faces, 400 witnesses. Neve wore a silver gown that night. Dominic had chosen it. He had chosen her jewelry as well, a string of white pearls that sat against her collarbone like a collar. Her hair had been styled by a woman who came to the house and did not speak to her, only adjusted and pinned and sprayed until Neve no longer recognized herself in the mirror. She was 7 months pregnant. The triplets moved inside her constantly now, a rolling, shifting weight that made it difficult to stand for long. But Dominic had insisted she attend. He had said it was important that she be seen, that his wife be present, that the family appear unified. She had believed him. They arrived at 8. Dominic held her arm as they walked through the entrance, and for a moment, standing beneath the golden light of those chandeliers, Neve allowed herself to feel something close to hope. Perhaps tonight would be different. Perhaps he would stay beside her. Perhaps the distance between them had only been stress, only been business, and only been the weight of empire pressing down on a man who carried too much. But by 8:30, he was gone. She saw him across the ballroom speaking with a woman she did not recognize. The woman was tall, dark-haired, wearing a gown the color of arterial blood. Her neck held a ruby pendant, the same pendant from the receipt Neve had found 3 months earlier, the one worth more than her mother's house. Neve's hand moved to her belly. She felt one of the babies kick. She told herself it was nothing. A business associate, a donor, a contact. She told herself the pendant was a coincidence, a similar design, a trick of the light. She told herself that Dominic would return to her side any moment and take her arm and whisper something dismissive about the woman in red, and they would laugh quietly together the way they used to in the first year. He did not return. At 9:15, the master of ceremonies took the stage to announce the evening's largest donor. The room quieted. Glasses stopped clinking. Conversations folded into silence, and Dominic Zareth walked to the microphone with the woman in red on his arm. Neve did not understand at first. She thought perhaps it was a mistake, a misunderstanding. She thought perhaps the woman was a representative of some foundation, some board, and some organization that Dominic supported. Then he spoke. "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight, and I want to introduce someone who has changed my life." He looked at the woman beside him, The ruby pendant caught the light. "Ilaria Sante," he said, "the woman I intend to marry." The room did not gasp. Rooms like that never do. Instead, there was a silence, a ripple of awareness, a collective turning of heads. And then, 400 faces found Neve Callister standing alone by the east window, 7 months pregnant, wearing pearls her husband had chosen, dressed in silver he had selected, carrying 3 children he had fathered. She saw the eyes. She saw the pity. She saw the satisfaction on some faces, the ones who had always resented her presence, who had always known she did not belong in this world. She saw the indifference on others, the ones who simply did not care, who viewed this as entertainment, as spectacle, as another story to tell at the next gala. And she saw Dominic. He was looking directly at her. His expression held nothing, no guilt, no shame, no recognition of what he had just done. He looked at her the way one looks at a chair that has been moved to the wrong corner of a room, an inconvenience, a detail to be corrected. Ilaria whispered something in his ear, and he smiled. Neve walked out of the ballroom. No one stopped her. No one spoke to her. She walked through the lobby with her hand on her belly and her vision blurring, and her breath coming in short, shallow gasps that she could not control. She walked through the revolving door and into the November night, and she stood on the sidewalk in her silver gown with the cold air cutting through the fabric, and she did not cry. She did not cry because crying was a luxury for women who had somewhere to go. And Neve Callister, for the first time in her adult life, had nowhere. The locks were changed by morning. Neve had spent the night at a hotel near the train station, a place that asked no questions and accepted cash. She had $62 in her purse, money she had taken from the household fund 3 weeks earlier for what she told the cook was a gift for her sister. She did not have a sister. She had simply learned, somewhere in the fog of her marriage, to prepare. When she returned to the house in Ashworth Hills the next morning, the gate did not respond to her code. She pressed the intercom. A voice she did not recognize told her that Mr. Zareth had left instructions. Her belongings would be sent to an address of her choosing. She was not to enter the property. She was no longer welcome. She stood at that gate for 11 minutes. She knew because she counted. She counted because counting was the only thing that kept her standing. 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way to 660. Then she walked away. The weeks that followed existed in fragments. A women's shelter in the Crestwood district that had 1 bed available. A social worker named Denise who helped her file paperwork for emergency assistance. A clinic where a doctor listened to the 3 heartbeats inside her and told her that stress was dangerous for the babies, that she needed rest, that she needed stability. As if stability were something you could pick up at a pharmacy. Dominic's lawyers sent a letter. It stated that due to irreconcilable differences, the marriage was being dissolved. It stated that any claims to marital assets would be contested vigorously. It stated that Mr. Zareth denied paternity of the unborn children and requested a DNA test upon their birth. Denied paternity. Neve read those words 17 times. She read them until they stopped making sense, until they became sounds without meaning, until she set the letter down and placed both hands on her belly and felt her children move and whispered to them that their father was a liar, that he knew, that he had always known. The triplets were born in January. 3 girls, identical, 6 pounds each. They arrived within 11 minutes of each other, screaming with the kind of fury that only belongs to people entering a world that has not yet disappointed them. Neve named them alone. No family in the waiting room, no husband pacing the corridor. Just Neve and a nurse named Gloria who held her hand during the contractions and told her she was stronger than she knew. Marigold, Sylvie, Odette. 3 names she had chosen from a book of flowers and ballets and things that were beautiful without apology. 3 names that belonged to no one else. 3 names that Dominic Zareth would never speak. She left the hospital 4 days later with 3 infants, a diaper bag donated by the shelter, and $214 in emergency funds. She had no home, no income, no family within 1,000 miles. The shelter had a 30-day limit, and she was on day 26. But she had her daughters. She had their weight in her arms. She had their breath against her skin. And she had something else. Something that had been buried so deep inside her for so long that she had forgotten it existed. Rage. The job listing was handwritten on an index card pinned to the community board at St. Maren's Church. Caretaker needed for rural property. Room and board included. Experience with children welcome. Inquire within. Neve had not intended to enter the church. She had only stopped because Sylvie was crying and the wind outside was too cold to stand in while she adjusted the second-hand stroller that held all 3 girls. The church door was unlocked. The foyer was warm, and the bulletin board was the first thing she saw when she stepped inside. She stared at the card for a long time. Room and board. Those 3 words pulsed like a heartbeat. Room and board meant a roof. It meant heat. It meant not standing in line at the shelter wondering if tonight there would be space. She inquired within. The priest was a man in his 60s named Father Brennan. He had white hair and kind eyes, and a habit of folding his hands when he listened, as if he were praying through his palms. He looked at Neve. He looked at the 3 infants in the stroller. He did not ask why she was alone. He did not ask where their father was. He simply handed her a slip of paper with an address and a name. The property belongs to a man named Cale Morrow, Father Brennan said. He lives alone. He is a good man, but a quiet one. He lost his wife and son 4 years ago, a car accident on the coast road. He does not speak of it, so I ask that you do not ask. He needs help with the land. You need a place to stay. Perhaps God has arranged a meeting? Neve took the paper. Her hands were trembling, but not from cold. She traveled to Fenwick by bus. It took 3 hours. The triplets slept for most of it, their tiny bodies nestled together in a nest of blankets she had made inside an old suitcase that a woman at the shelter had given her. When the bus stopped at the edge of town, Neve stepped off and looked around and saw nothing but fields, a church steeple in the distance, and a single road winding north. She walked for 40 minutes. Marigold woke up halfway and began to fuss. So Neve sang to her softly, a song her own mother used to sing, something about rivers and sleep and coming home. She did not know all the words anymore, but she hummed the parts she had forgotten, and Marigold quieted. The cottage appeared around a bend in the road, white shutters, a gray door, weathered and peeling, waiting for someone to care enough to repaint it. A garden that had gone wild but was still beautiful, the way abandoned things can be beautiful when they have been loved once. A man was standing in the garden. He had dark hair with gray at the temples. His sleeves were rolled to the elbows. His hands were covered in soil. He was perhaps 40, perhaps older. It was hard to tell because his face had the quality of someone who had stopped counting years. He looked at Neve. He looked at the suitcase. He looked at the 3 small faces peering out from the blankets. And he said nothing. Neve opened her mouth to introduce herself, to explain, to perform the speech she had rehearsed on the bus about being hardworking and reliable and willing to learn. But before she could speak, one of the triplets, Odette, the smallest, the quietest, reached out her tiny hand toward the man with soil on his fingers. Cale Morrow looked at that hand. Something in his face shifted. Not softened, shifted, like a door opening 1 inch in a house that had been sealed for years. "You must be tired," he said. His voice was low and rough from disuse. "Come inside. I will make tea." He turned and walked toward the cottage. And Neve Callister, for the first time since the night of the Castellan Gala, followed someone who expected nothing from her in return. Cale Morrow did not speak about himself. Not that first day. Not that first week. He showed Neve to a room at the back of the cottage with 2 windows that looked out onto the meadow. He carried in a crib that had been stored in the attic, dusty but sturdy, and he wiped it down without being asked. He left food on the kitchen table, bread and cheese and fruit, and he disappeared into the garden before she could thank him. For the first month, they lived like ghosts passing through the same house. He woke before dawn and worked the land. She woke when the triplets woke, which was often, and she fed them and changed them and rocked them and tried to remember what it felt like to sleep for more than 2 hours at a time. They crossed paths in the kitchen, in the hallway, at the garden gate. He nodded. She nodded. Neither asked questions, but Neve watched him. She watched because watching was the habit of a woman who had learned that survival depended on reading the people around her. She watched the way he knelt in the soil with his hands pressed flat against the earth, as if he were listening to something beneath it. She watched the way he paused at the window sometimes and looked toward the road with an expression that was not quite waiting but lived in the same country. She watched the way he avoided the room at the end of the upstairs hallway, the one with the door that was always closed, the one she had learned not to ask about. It was Father Brennan who told her. He visited the cottage in the 2nd month, bringing jars of preserves from the church pantry and news from town. While Cale was outside repairing the fence, Father Brennan sat with Neve in the kitchen and spoke quietly, the way people speak about wounds that have not fully healed. His wife's name was Rena. His son was Tobias. The boy was 3 years old. They were driving home from visiting her mother on the coast. A truck crossed the center line. Cale was not in the car. He had stayed behind to finish work on the cottage. He was hanging shutters when the police arrived. Neve looked through the window at the man kneeling in the garden. His hands were deep in the soil. His face was turned away. He blamed himself, Father Brennan said. He has never said so, but I know. He believed that if he had been in the car, he could have done something. Swerved. Protected them. Died with them. Instead, he lived. And living for Cale became its own kind of punishment. Neve thought of the room at the end of the hallway, the closed door, the silence that surrounded it like a moat. Why he agreed to let me stay, she asked. Father Brennan looked at the 3 infants sleeping in the crib Cale had carried down from the attic. The same crib, Neve realized suddenly, that must have once held a boy named Tobias. Perhaps, Father Brennan said, because the silence was becoming louder than the grief. The first time Cale held one of the triplets, it was an accident. Neve had been carrying Sylvie toward the kitchen when she tripped on the edge of the rug. She did not fall, but she stumbled, and her grip loosened, and for one terrible half-second, the baby slipped. Cale was there. He had been walking through the doorway at exactly that moment, and his hands caught Sylvie before Neve could even scream. He stood frozen, the baby in his arms, his face pale, his breath shallow. Neve reached for Sylvie, but before she could take her, Sylvie did something she had never done with a stranger. She settled. Her small body relaxed against Cale's chest, her fist curled around the collar of his shirt, and she sighed, the way babies sigh when they feel safe. Cale looked at Neve. His eyes were wet. "I am sorry," he said. "I did not mean to. I should not have." "You caught her," Neve said. "You saved her." He handed Sylvie back carefully, the way a man handles something holy. Then he turned and walked out of the cottage and did not return until dark. But the wall had cracked. In the weeks that followed, Cale began to linger. He no longer disappeared before Neve came to the kitchen. He poured tea for 2 instead of 1. He asked about the triplets. Small questions at first. Surface questions. Which one slept best? Which one fussed most? Which one had started to smile? Neve answered, and her answers grew longer, and the silences between them grew shorter, and one evening, for the first time, they sat on the bench in the garden and watched the sun go down together. He told her about Rena that night, about how they had met at a harvest festival when he was 22, about how she had laughed at his shyness and asked him to dance before he could find the courage to ask her, about how Tobias had been born in this cottage, in the room at the end of the hallway, with a midwife from town and a thunderstorm rattling the windows, about how the boy had loved sunflowers, had called them suns on sticks, and how Cale had planted a row of them every spring since, even though Tobias would never see them again. Neve did not tell him about Dominic that night. She was not ready, but she told him about the triplets' birth, about naming them alone, about the nurse named Gloria who had held her hand. And when she finished, Cale said something that broke something open inside her. You did not fail them by being alone. You saved them by being enough. She cried. Not the controlled, silent tears she had trained herself to produce during her marriage. Real tears. The kind that come with sound, with shaking, with the release of something that has been held too tightly for too long. Cale did not touch her. He did not try to comfort her with words. He simply sat beside her on the bench and let her cry, and when she was finished, he handed her a handkerchief that smelled like soil and sunlight, and he said, "Tomorrow I will teach you how to plant tomatoes." And that was how love began. Not with declarations, not with grand gestures, with tomatoes, with tea, with a man who handed her a handkerchief and promised tomorrow. The triplets grew. They crawled, then walked, then ran. They learned to say mama, then more, then mine. They learned to say Cale, though it came out sounding like K, and he did not correct them, because the sound of his name in their small voices was a kind of resurrection. He read to them at night. He carried them on his shoulders through the meadow. He built them a swing from rope and an old oak branch, and he pushed them gently, one at a time, while the other two waited with the impatience of children who have not yet learned that their turn will come. Neve watched him become something she had not dared to hope for. A father, not by blood, not by law, by choice, by presence, by the daily accumulation of moments that matter more than any ceremony, and she fell in love with him, not suddenly, not dramatically, the way seasons change, the way rivers carve stone, slowly, irreversibly, completely. On a night in late autumn, almost 2 years after she had arrived at the cottage with a suitcase and 3 infants and nothing else, Cale kissed her for the first time. They were standing in the kitchen. The triplets were asleep. The house was quiet. He had been telling her about a memory from his childhood, something about catching fireflies with his brother, and she had laughed, and he had stopped mid-sentence and looked at her with an expression that made her breath catch. I did not think I would ever feel this again, he said. Feel what? She asked. Alive, he said, and he kissed her. Gently, carefully, the way a man kisses when he knows that what he holds is precious and breakable and worth every risk. The word arrived on a Sunday. Neve had taken the triplets to the garden after breakfast. It was June. The sunflowers had grown taller than Marigold, who was the tallest of the 3, and the girls had developed a habit of measuring themselves against the stalks each morning to see who had grown overnight. None of them ever had, but the ritual mattered, and Cale stood with the measuring string while they pressed their backs against the stems and demanded verdicts. He was kneeling in the grass, adjusting the string for Odette, when Sylvie tugged at his sleeve. "Papa," she said. "Papa, watch me spin." Neve was sitting on the bench. Her hands were wrapped around a cup of tea. The cup nearly slipped from her fingers. Cale went still. His face did not move. His eyes did not blink. He looked at Sylvie, this child who was not his, this girl who carried the blood of a man who had never held her, and he could not speak. Marigold ran toward him. "Papa, pick me up." Then Odette, the smallest, the quietest, the one who had reached for him on the very first day. "Papa, I love you." Kale looked at Neve. His eyes were wet. His hands were trembling against the measuring string, and Neve nodded. She nodded because there are moments when language fails, when yes and no are insufficient, when the only vocabulary available is the body itself. She nodded because this man had earned that word in 1,000 small ways that Dominic Zareth never had. She nodded because her daughters had chosen, and their choice was right, and she would not take it from them. Kale opened his arms. All three girls ran to him. They collided with his chest. They wrapped their small arms around his neck. They buried their faces in his shoulders. And he held them. He held them the way a man holds something he thought he would never have again. He held them the way a man holds his second chance. He held them the way a father holds his children, which is what he was now, which is what they had made him. With a single word spoken on a Sunday morning in a garden full of sunflowers, Neve set down her tea. She walked across the grass. She knelt beside them. And she became part of the embrace, part of the tangle of arms and laughter and tears, part of the family that had been built not from blood, but from choice. Kale looked at her over the heads of the triplets. "I do not deserve this," he whispered. "You do," she said. "You do." And that was when she saw him, standing at the edge of the garden wall, 20 feet away, in a coat that cost more than this cottage. His face pale, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the scene before him with an expression that contained rage and disbelief and something else, something that might have been grief if he had been capable of such a thing. Dominic Zareth. He had found them. Dominic had not come alone. 2 men stood behind him at the garden gate, broad and silent in dark suits, their hands folded in front of them the way hands fold when they are trained to reach for weapons. A black car idled on the road beyond, its engine a low hum that seemed to vibrate through the morning air. Neve rose to her feet. Her body moved before her mind could catch up, positioning itself between Kale and the triplets and the man at the gate. Dominic's eyes traveled across the scene. The garden, the cottage, the sunflowers, the man kneeling in the grass with 3 children in his arms, his children, his blood, calling another man Papa. Something shifted in his face. Not pain. Dominic did not feel pain. He felt loss of control. He felt the sensation of something slipping through his fingers that he had not realized he wanted until it was gone. "Neve," he said. His voice was calm, controlled. The voice of a man who had conducted boardroom negotiations and back-alley arrangements with the same measured tone. "I have been looking for you." She did not answer. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. "You left without permission," he continued. "You took what belongs to me." "They do not belong to you," Neve said. The words came from somewhere deep, somewhere she had buried 2 years ago on a sidewalk outside the Monarch Hotel. "You denied them. You denied paternity. You sent lawyers to tell me they were not yours. I have reconsidered." Neve stared at him. 2 years of silence. 2 years of nothing. No letters, no contact, no support. And now he stood at her gate speaking of reconsideration as if the triplets were a stock portfolio he had neglected to review. "Why?" she asked. "Why now?" Dominic's jaw tightened. He glanced at Kale, who had risen to his feet with Odette still in his arms. The 2 men measured each other across 20 feet of garden. Because Ilaria could not give him children, Neve understood suddenly. She saw it in his face, in the flicker of something beneath the mask. The mistress, the woman in the red gown, the ruby pendant, the intended bride, she had failed to produce an heir. And Dominic Zareth, the man who controlled half the city, needed legacy, needed blood, needed something to inherit the empire he had built. He had come for the triplets not because he wanted them, he had come because he needed them. "You will return with me," Dominic said. "All of you. I have arranged for a car. Your things can be sent." No. The word came from Cale. Quiet. Final. The voice of a man who had lost everything once and would not lose again. Dominic looked at him. Who are you? The man who will not let you take them? Dominic smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. It was the smile of a man who had broken things before and expected to break things again. You do not understand who you are speaking to. I understand exactly who I am speaking to, Cale said. His voice remained calm, but something beneath it had turned to iron. You are a man who had everything and threw it away because you could not see its value. You are a man who humiliated his wife in front of 400 people. You are a man who denied his own children and left their mother to deliver them alone in a charity hospital. He took a step forward. I know who you are. You are no one. Dominic's face changed. The mask slipped. Beneath it was rage, pure and undisguised, the kind of rage that belongs to men who have never been told no. You will regret this, he said. Perhaps, Cale said, but they will not, because they will never know you. They will grow up safe and loved and whole. And when they are old enough to ask where they came from, their mother will tell them the truth. That their father was a coward who chose pride over family. And they will look at me, the man who chose them, and they will understand what a real father is. Dominic stood at the gate for a long moment. His hands were fists at his sides. His breath was shallow. The two men behind him waited for a signal that never came. Because Dominic Zareth, for all his power, understood something in that moment. He could take these children by force. He had the resources. He had the lawyers. He had the connections. But if he did, they would hate him. They would grow up with the knowledge of what he had done, and they would never, ever call him Papa. The word burned in his chest like acid. He turned and walked back to the car. The two men followed. The engine revved. The black car pulled away from Briarwood Lane and disappeared around the bend. And Dominic Zareth drove back to his city, to his empire, to his 14-room house with no children inside, and he felt something he had never felt before. Empty. He did not give up. In the months that followed, Dominic Zareth deployed every weapon in his arsenal. Lawyers sent letters demanding custody hearings. Private investigators filed reports on Cale Morrow, searching for any flaw, any crack, and any shadow that could be used against him. A family court in the city received petitions arguing that the triplets had been unlawfully removed from their father's jurisdiction. But Neve had something Dominic had not counted on: documentation. During her years of marriage, during the slow erasure of her autonomy, she had kept records. Not because she had planned to leave, not because she had imagined this moment, but because some part of her, some buried instinct for survival, had told her to save the receipts, to photograph the bruises that no one ever saw, to write dates and times in a small notebook she kept hidden in a box of tampons where Dominic would never look. That notebook now sat on the desk of a family attorney named Constance Fairweather. Constance was 63 years old. She had practiced family law for 38 years. She had faced men like Dominic Zareth before, men with money and power and the belief that both made them untouchable. She enjoyed proving them wrong. The custody hearing took place in November, almost exactly 2 years after the Castellan Gala. Neve sat at a table beside Constance. Cale sat in the gallery behind her. The triplets were not present. They were at the cottage with Father Brennan, who had closed the church for the day to stay with them. Dominic sat across the aisle. He wore a suit that cost more than most people's annual salaries. His lawyers flanked him like sentinels. But when Constance Fairweather presented the evidence, the room changed. The photographs of bruises on Neve's arms, the medical records from a clinic visit she had made 3 years earlier for stress-related complications during pregnancy. Complications caused, the doctor's note said, by domestic tension. The testimony from a former housekeeper who had been dismissed after she suggested that Mrs. Zareth seemed frightened of her husband. the financial records showing that Neve had been denied access to marital funds throughout the marriage. The letter from Dominic's own lawyers denying paternity. Your Honor, Constance said, Mr. Zareth did not want these children when they were born. He denied they were his. He left their mother to deliver them alone and to raise them without support for over 2 years. He made no attempt at contact, no attempt at relationship, no attempt at fatherhood. And now, because his circumstances have changed, he seeks to reclaim them like lost property. These are not objects. They are children. And they have a father. A man who has held them and fed them and read to them and taught them to plant sunflowers. The fact that he does not share their blood does not diminish his claim. It strengthens it. Because he chose them. Every single day for 2 years, he chose them. The judge listened. She reviewed the evidence. She looked at Dominic Zareth, at his expensive suit, at his expensive lawyers, at the careful blankness of his expression. And then she looked at Neve. Mrs. Callister, she said, what do your daughters call Mr. Morrow? Neve's voice was steady. They call him Papa. The judge nodded slowly. She wrote something on the document before her. Custody, she said, is granted to the mother. Visitation rights for the biological father are denied pending a full psychological evaluation and completion of a parenting course. The court finds that Mr. Zareth has shown no genuine interest in the welfare of these children and that his petition is motivated by personal legacy concerns rather than parental love. Dominic's face did not move, but something behind his eyes collapsed. He had lost, not to a rival, not to an enemy, not to another man with power and resources and weapons. He had lost to a woman with a notebook, to a man with soil on his hands, to 3 small girls who had never seen his face and did not know his name. He had lost to love, and there was no lawyer in the world who could appeal that verdict. The wedding took place in spring. Not a large wedding. Not a lavish one. Just the cottage garden with the sunflowers in bloom, and Father Brennan reading from a small leather book, and the triplets standing in matching yellow dresses that Neve had sewn herself. Cale wore a gray suit he had owned for 15 years, the same suit he had worn to Rena's funeral. The same suit he had thought he would never wear again for any happy occasion. Neve wore a white dress she had found at a second-hand shop in town, simple and clean, and nothing like the silver gown that had once made her feel like property. They exchanged vows they had written themselves. I promise to stay, Cale said. Not because I have to, because I choose to. Every day, for the rest of my life. I promise to trust, Neve said. Not because it is easy, because you have earned it. Every day, for the rest of my life. Marigold served as the flower girl, though she spent most of the ceremony trying to catch a butterfly. Sylvie held the rings on a small pillow and looked extremely serious about the responsibility. Odette stood beside Cale and held his hand, and when Father Brennan asked if there were any objections, she said very loudly, "No, he is ours." Everyone laughed, even Cale, whose laughter had been buried for 4 years under the weight of grief, laughed with his head thrown back, and his eyes wet, and his heart fuller than he had ever believed possible. After the ceremony, they ate cake in the garden. The triplets got frosting on their faces and their dresses and somehow in their hair. Neve did not scold them. She took photographs. She kissed their foreheads. She told them they could have seconds. That night, after the girls were asleep, Neve and Cale sat on the bench in the garden. The same bench where he had first told her about Rena. The same bench where she had first cried in front of another person in years. The same bench where love had quietly, slowly, irreversibly begun. Thank you, Neve said. Cale looked at her. For what? For staying. For choosing us. For becoming their father when you did not have to. Cale was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I did not become their father. They made me one. There is a difference. Neve leaned her head against his shoulder. the stars were out. The sunflowers were dark shapes against the sky. Somewhere in the cottage, 3 small girls slept with full bellies and clean sheets, and no memory of a man who had once denied their existence. 1 year later, a letter arrived. It was addressed to Neve Morrow. She had taken Cale's name after the wedding, not because tradition demanded it, but because she wanted to. Because Callister had been the name she was born with, and Zareth had been the name she was given, but Morrow was the name she had chosen. The letter was from a law firm in the city. It informed her that Dominic Zareth had died 3 weeks earlier. Heart attack. He had been alone in his 14-room house in Ashworth Hills. The housekeeper had found him in the morning. The letter also informed her that Mr. Zareth had amended his will 6 months before his death. The triplets, Marigold, Sylvie, and Odette, had been named as beneficiaries of a trust fund that would become accessible when they turned 18. It was a large sum. Generational wealth. The kind of money that could open doors and change futures. Neve read the letter twice. Then she folded it and placed it in a drawer. She did not tell the girls. Not yet. Someday, when they were older, she would explain. She would tell them about the man who had fathered them, about his choices, about his absence, about the money he had left behind. She would let them decide what to do with it. But for now, they did not need to know. For now, they had a father who pushed them on the swing and read to them at night and planted sunflowers in their names every spring. They had a mother who braided their hair every morning and kissed their foreheads and told them everything would be okay. They had a home with a blue door that Neve had painted herself. They had a garden with tomatoes and sunflowers and a bench where their parents sat every evening watching the sun go down. And they had each other. Marigold, the leader. Sylvie, the dreamer. Odette, the gentle one. 3 girls who had been born into chaos and raised in peace. 3 girls who would never remember the night their mother walked out of a ballroom in a silver gown with her heart breaking inside her chest. 3 girls who would only know the after, the cottage, the garden, the man they called Papa. On a morning in late June, Neve stood at the kitchen window and watched Cale in the garden with the triplets. He was teaching them to plant tomatoes. They were covered in soil. They were laughing. And Neve Morrow, who had once been Neve Zareth, who had once been Neve Callister, who had once been a woman with nowhere to go and no one to call, pressed her hand against the glass and smiled. Not the careful smile of a woman who has learned to perform happiness. The real kind. The kind that starts at the mouth and travels to the eyes and does not stop until it reaches somewhere deep inside the chest where trust lives, or where trust has been rebuilt. Brick by brick, day by day, choice by choice. She had survived. She had more than survived. She had become.